You check your phone before breakfast. Somewhere far away, two countries are arguing over a border. You scroll past it. It feels distant. It feels like the kind of news that could never actually touch your life. That is exactly what most people across Europe believed in the early summer of 1914. Then a man with a pistol stepped out onto a street corner in Sarajevo. And within 5 weeks, the largest empires on earth were marching millions of men toward each other. By the time it ended, roughly 17 million people were dead, entire dynasties had collapsed, and the map of the world had been redrawn in blood. You have probably heard the short version. An archduke was shot. A war started. But that explanation is almost a lie by omission. The assassination did not cause World War I. It only pulled the pin on a grenade that had already been built, primed, and quietly handed to nearly every government in Europe years earlier. So ask yourself this: how does one gunshot in one small city turn into a war that swallows an entire continent and then the world? To understand that, you have to go back further than June 1914. You have to understand what Europe had quietly become in the decades before anyone fired a single shot. By the early 1900s, the great powers of Europe were bound together by a tangled web of secret and semi-secret military alliances. Germany stood with Austria-Hungary and, more loosely, with Italy. France stood with Russia. Britain leaned toward France and Russia, though it had made no ironclad promise to fight alongside them. On paper, this system was designed to preserve peace. The logic seemed sound. If every major power had a protector standing behind it, no one would dare start a fight they could not win alone. In practice, it built something closer to a row of loaded dominoes standing on a table that was already shaking. If one country went to war, its allies were bound by treaty and by national pride to follow. A small, local conflict could no longer stay small. Every regional dispute now carried the weight of the entire continent behind it, whether anyone wanted that or not. At the same time, something else was shifting underneath the surface of these societies. Nationalism was rising fast, and it was being deliberately fed. Newspapers printed stories glorifying military strength and warning of foreign threats. School children were taught that their empire was destined for greatness, and that rival nations stood in the way of that destiny. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany wanted an empire that could finally rival Britain's on the seas and in the colonies. France still burned with humiliation from its crushing defeat by Germany in 1871 and quietly hungered for revenge and the return of lost territory. Austria-Hungary was an aging, multi-ethnic empire cracking apart from the inside. Desperate for a decisive show of strength to prove to its own restless populations that it still mattered on the world stage. And underneath all of it sat an arms race that historians have compared to a slow-motion explosion building for a decade. Germany was building battleships as fast as its shipyards could produce them, trying to match the Royal Navy that Britain considered its lifeline. France and Russia were expanding their standing armies year after year, each increase provoking a matching increase from Germany. Military planners on every side were quietly drafting detailed mathematical schedules for exactly how fast they could mobilize millions of soldiers the moment war was declared, down to which train would carry which regiment on which day. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. These mobilization plans were so rigid, so mechanical, that once they were set into motion, they were almost impossible to stop or even slow down. Germany's plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, assumed that if Russia began mobilizing its army, Germany had only days to defeat France before turning east, because Russia's sheer size meant it would eventually field an overwhelming force. War under this plan was no longer a decision made carefully in the moment by cautious leaders. It was a machine built years in advance by generals and bureaucrats, sitting quietly, waiting for someone, anyone, to flip the switch. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary traveled to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, to inspect military maneuvers, he was walking into a city that had already been quietly wired with tension for years. Bosnia had recently been formally annexed by Austria-Hungary, and Serbian nationalists across the region were furious about it, viewing Bosnia as land that rightfully belonged within a future Greater Serbia. A group of young revolutionaries loosely connected to a secret Serbian nationalist network known as the Black Hand planned to assassinate the Archduke during his visit. Their first attempt that morning failed badly. A conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off and injured people in the vehicle behind him instead. By nearly every account, the plot should have ended right there. A failed attempt quietly folded into history. But through a stunning chain of wrong turns and miscommunication, the Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital later that day. His driver, not properly informed of the new route, took a wrong turn directly onto a street where one of the original conspirators happened to still be standing. A 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip found himself standing just a few feet from the stalled car. He stepped forward and fired two shots. One killed the Archduke, the other killed his wife, Sophie. It was, by nearly every serious historical account, an assassination that succeeded almost entirely by accident. And yet that accident became the spark that a full decade of tension had been quietly waiting for. Austria-Hungary blamed the Serbian government for the assassination and used it as the excuse it had wanted for years to crush a rival power it saw as a growing threat. It issued Serbia an ultimatum with demands so severe that many diplomats at the time privately believed it had been written specifically to be rejected. Serbia remarkably agreed to almost every single demand. Austria-Hungary declared war anyway, just days later. Then the dominoes began falling exactly as the alliance system had been built to make them fall. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of fellow Slavic Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany, honoring its alliance with Austria-Hungary and terrified of facing Russia's full strength later, declared war on Russia. Because the Schlieffen Plan demanded a lightning strike against France before Russia could fully mobilize, Germany also declared war on France. And to reach French territory quickly, German troops marched straight through neutral Belgium. That single decision brought Britain into the war, since Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in a treaty signed decades earlier in 1839. In less than 6 weeks, a regional political murder had escalated into a war stretching from Western Europe to the Ottoman Empire, from colonial Africa to islands in the Pacific. Men who had never heard of Sarajevo were being handed rifles in villages thousands of miles away. Notice how little room there was for anyone to simply stop and think. Between the assassination on June 28th and Britain's declaration of war on August 4th, only 37 days passed. 37 days to move an entire continent from a funeral to a battlefield. Ambassadors exchanged panicked telegrams around the clock, many of them arriving after the decisions they were meant to influence had already been made. The German Kaiser scribbled increasingly desperate notes in the margins of reports, at one point begging his own generals to find a way to attack only Russia and leave France alone. His generals told him it was too late. The trains, they said, were already running on their timetable, and there was no plan on paper for stopping them halfway. This is usually where the story stops in most textbooks, but historians have spent over a century arguing about what was actually happening underneath the surface of these decisions, and their conclusions reveal something far more unsettling than a single clear villain. The German historian Fritz Fischer, writing in the 1960s, argued in his research that Germany bore the primary responsibility for the war. Using newly uncovered government documents, he claimed that German military and political leaders saw a major war as both inevitable and, in a chilling way, desirable. A chance to secure German dominance in Europe before Russia's growing industrial and military power made such a victory impossible. His findings shocked post-war Germany and permanently reshaped how historians understood the war's origins. But the historian Christopher Clark, in his widely read book The Sleepwalkers, published decades later, offers a strikingly different picture. Clark argues that no single nation actually wanted this exact war, in this exact shape. Instead, every government made a series of small, seemingly reasonable decisions, each one reacting to the last, none of them able to see the full catastrophic picture of where those decisions were leading together. The protagonists of 1914, he wrote, were sleepwalkers, watchful but unseeing, haunted by dreams, yet blind to the reality of the horror they were about to bring into the world. And the historian Barbara Tuchman, in her Pulitzer winning account, The Guns of August, focused on something just as chilling in its own way. Once the mobilization orders were signed and the trains began running on their fixed schedules, almost no one, not the Kaiser, not the Tsar, not the generals who had built these plans, seemed able to stop the machine they themselves had constructed. Diplomatic telegrams pleading for restraint arrived hours too late. Leaders who privately doubted the wisdom of war found themselves swept along by a system too large and too mechanical for any single person to control. So, which explanation is the true one? A deliberate grab for power by ambitious empires, or a tragic accident born from a system too rigid to bend once it started moving? The honest answer that researchers have largely converged on is unsettling precisely because it refuses to pick a side. It was both. Ambition and fear built the weapon over decades. Rigid structure and blind momentum pulled the trigger in a matter of weeks. What makes this story worth telling you today isn't only what happened in the summer of 1914. It's what it quietly reveals about how catastrophe actually unfolds in general. You tend to imagine disasters as sudden, as caused by one bad decision, or one clearly evil person standing at the center of it. World War I shows you something far less comfortable. It shows you a world where alliances built to protect people ended up trapping them instead, where pride and fear constructed systems too complicated for any single leader to fully see or control, where a rigid plan, once set into motion, kept running even after the humans behind it privately wanted it to stop. Does that sound at all familiar to you? You live inside interconnected systems too, even if the weapons have changed shape entirely. Financial markets that can crash on the other side of the planet and still quietly drain your savings. Supply chains so tangled that one blocked shipping lane can empty store shelves thousands of miles away. Online arguments that escalate not because either side actually wants a full-blown war, but because each response simply reacts to the last provocation. Neither side able to see how far the chain has already traveled from where it started. The mechanisms have changed completely, the underlying pattern has not moved an inch. Think about how often you have watched a small disagreement, online or in your own life, spiral into something neither person actually intended. Nobody wakes up planning to end a friendship over one comment, but each reply provokes a slightly sharper reply, each side certain it is only defending itself, until the original disagreement is barely visible underneath the wreckage. Historians studying 1914 call this a spiral model of conflict, and researchers in psychology and international relations have since applied the same framework far beyond Europe's old battlefields, from arms races during the Cold War to modern political polarization. The mechanism that dragged four empires into catastrophe is not locked away in a museum. It is quietly available to any system, any relationship, any argument, built on enough unspoken tension and enough momentum once it starts. By November of 1918, the war that German soldiers had been promised would be over by Christmas had killed roughly 17 million people and wounded 20 million more. Four empires, the Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman, collapsed entirely within just a few years of each other. Borders across Europe and the Middle East were redrawn on maps by men who had never visited the regions they were dividing, and a peace treaty signed at Versailles imposed such harsh terms on Germany that many historians now believe it quietly planted the seeds for an even larger war just 2 decades later. All of it traces back to a wrong turn on a single street in Sarajevo and a decade-old system of alliances wound so tightly that one shot was all it ever needed to pull an entire continent down with it. You check your phone before breakfast. Somewhere far away, two countries are arguing over a border. It still feels distant, but now you know exactly what a distant argument, layered onto enough hidden alliances, enough wounded pride, and enough machinery already quietly set in motion, can actually become.